Welcome to Blackman Folk Tales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. Ethan Cole stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen, the cold light illuminating the fatigue etched deep into his face. Around him, the small apartment seemed to close in like the walls themselves were pressing down, reminding him of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every abandoned weekend he had poured into his novel. The rejection emails piled up like an unrelenting tide. Not quite what we're looking for, we don't see commercial potential, thank you but we must pass. Each one landed like a hammer strike on his pride, yet even more cruelly they chipped away at his confidence. Ethan had lived for these words, had dreamed for years that one day his story, the story that consumed him, that he had nurtured from the tiniest spark of inspiration into a living, breathing narrative, would find a home. And yet, night after night, the messages told him he was invisible, that his voice did not matter, that his passion, his relentless devotion, was nothing more than a futile echo in a world that refused to listen. He looked around the room at the stacks of crumpled drafts that had once been sacred, at the worn notebooks filled with scribbled ideas and half-finished sentences, and felt the crushing weight of disappointment like a boulder pressing against his chest. Memories of early encouragement, from a college professor who had once called him a writer who could move mountains with words, haunted him, bittersweet now, as if mocking him for having believed in a dream that the world clearly did not share. And in the silence, broken only by the hum of his laptop and the distant traffic outside, Ethan felt the creeping temptation to quit, to abandon this obsession entirely, to delete the manuscript and pretend it had never existed, as if erasing it could somehow erase the pain of being rejected by all. Yet, as the despair threatened to consume him, a stubborn ember of hope stirred deep within Ethan's chest, small but defiant, refusing to be snuffed out by the cold verdicts of strangers who had never known the hours of anguish, the nights of solitary writing, the depth of his imagination. He remembered why he had started this journey in the first place, because stories mattered, because some truths could only live in the careful arrangement of words, because his characters, his world, his universe demanded to exist, demanded to be heard. And so, with trembling hands, he opened a new email draft titled simply, "To whom it may concern," and began to write not as a desperate man pleading for acceptance, but as a soul declaring the truth of his art. Each sentence he typed was a piece of himself, raw and unfiltered, poured onto the screen with a fervor born of years of rejection and isolation. He wrote of loss and love, of human fragility and resilience, of truths too painful to speak aloud yet too vital to remain buried. Hours passed unnoticed. Rain began tapping against the window, a gentle rhythm that mirrored the pounding of his heart. Ethan didn't stop to edit or second-guess himself. He wrote as though the act itself could save him, as though this final plea might reach someone, anyone, who could see the story not as flawed or incomplete but as a reflection of life's complicated beauty. In that moment, alone in his dimly lit apartment, Ethan felt both desperation and liberation, the despair of countless no's, tempered by a fragile but undeniable sense that this one time, he was giving everything not just to the world but to himself. By the time Ethan pressed send, exhaustion weighed on him like a physical force, but there was also a strange exhilaration, a trembling anticipation that he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his eyes, listening to the rain's soft drumming and feeling the quiet hum of the city beyond the window, a city that had seemed so indifferent, so cold to his existence. He knew that this one email might be ignored, might vanish into the void like all the others, and yet, for the first time in a long while, he refused to measure the worth of his story by others' approval. He had done the impossible. He had bared his soul in words, in sentences that carried the essence of his being, in paragraphs that held his blood, sweat, and tears. The manuscript he had crafted with painstaking care, the story that had been his constant companion through nights of loneliness and days of doubt, had finally left his hands, sent out into the unknown. And in the quiet aftermath, Ethan allowed himself a moment of fragile hope, imagining just for a heartbeat that someone, just one person, might read his words and see not the mistakes, the rough edges or the flaws, but the truth, the soul, the heartbeat behind them. For a man who had been rejected by all, the possibility that someone might believe seemed both terrifying and magnificent, a thin but dazzling thread of light cutting through the long heavy darkness he had lived in for so long. And though sleep eluded him, and though uncertainty loomed like a shadow over the horizon of the next day, Ethan fell into a restless, almost euphoric state, knowing that for the first time in years, he had done everything in his power to give his story a chance, and perhaps, just perhaps, the world might finally listen. Days slipped into nights, and the silence from Ethan's inbox became its own cruel companion. He had grown used to it, the emptiness after every submission, the aching stillness that followed each hopeful click of send. But this time the waiting felt different, heavier. He avoided opening his email for days, afraid of seeing yet another rejection. He spent his hours pacing the apartment, rearranging the same scattered papers, staring out the rain-soaked window as if the sky itself might deliver his answers. When he finally forced himself to check his inbox late one evening, his heart froze. There it was, an unread message, its subject line plain but piercing: "We've reviewed your submission." For a full minute he couldn't bring himself to open it. He stared at the words, feeling his pulse throb in his ears. Every nerve in his body screamed that this would be just another reminder that he wasn't enough. But something, perhaps that small ember of stubborn faith, urged him on. When he finally clicked it open, his breath caught halfway through the first line. The letter wasn't what he expected. It didn't begin with rejection. It began with belief. The sender's name was Claire Whitman, an editor and founder of a small independent publishing house. Her message was simple yet powerful: "Your story is raw, imperfect, but alive." It moved me in ways I can't fully explain. I believe in it, and in you. Those words shattered something inside Ethan, not from pain, but from an overwhelming surge of emotion. For years he had been told his writing was too strange, too emotional, too unrefined. But here, in black and white, was someone who saw beauty in that imperfection, who saw him. He read the message over and over, his eyes stinging as the reality sank in. Someone somewhere believed. He typed back a trembling response: "Thank you. I don't know what to say except that I won't let you down." What followed over the next few days became a new chapter in his life, one written not in solitude but in collaboration. Claire asked to see his full manuscript, and he sent it immediately. When she called him for the first time, her voice was calm but brimming with quiet excitement. She spoke about his story as if it mattered deeply, dissecting themes, characters, emotions and even flaws, but always with respect, always with a tone that said this is worth saving. Their partnership became a lifeline. They worked late into the night, discussing characters that felt more like living souls than fiction. Claire had a way of seeing what Ethan couldn't. She could sense the potential beneath the rough edges. Every edit, every suggestion was a conversation, not a correction. Through her faith, Ethan began to rediscover his own. The rejections that had once haunted him began to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet confidence he hadn't felt in years. They debated fiercely at times, over a line of dialogue, a chapter ending, a character's decision. But even in disagreement there was mutual respect. Claire often said, "A story isn't perfect when it's safe. It's perfect when it's honest." That sentence stayed with him, echoing through his thoughts as they reshaped the novel into something truer, bolder, more alive than he had ever imagined. He began to laugh again during their calls, to feel pride instead of fear. Somewhere between exhaustion and inspiration, Ethan realized that belief, real, unwavering belief, had the power to bring the dead back to life. And in a way that was exactly what Claire had done for him. The morning Ethan Cole walked into the small bookstore in the heart of the city, the world seemed strangely softer, quieter, almost reverent. His book, The Glass Between Us, was displayed on a modest wooden table near the entrance. The sight of his name printed on the cover hit him like a wave. For a long moment he just stood there, unable to move, his chest tight with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Around him, the store buzzed with quiet conversation and the sound of pages turning. He watched as a woman picked up a copy, flipped through it, and smiled faintly before carrying it to the counter. That simple act felt monumental. Someone was choosing his story, the one everyone had once dismissed as worthless. Reviews began pouring in over the following weeks, not from critics, but from readers who found themselves reflected in his words. They spoke of how his story made them cry, how it reminded them that broken things could still shine. It wasn't about fame or sales or recognition, it was about connection. The very thing Ethan had longed for all those years in isolation had finally arrived, wrapped not in grand success, but in quiet human resonance. Claire was there too, standing beside him, her smile calm and knowing. She never sought credit, never made it about herself. She simply watched him with the satisfaction of someone who had seen a seed grow into a forest. Ethan turned to her, his voice soft with emotion. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see," he said. She shook her head gently. "No," she replied, "you always had it. You just needed someone to remind you." That moment would stay with him forever. The woman who had once been a stranger had become the bridge between his despair and his destiny. He realized that all the rejections, all the nights of doubt were not wasted. They were steps that led him to her, to this moment, to the version of himself who had finally learned that worth was never determined by applause. Later, when he stood before a small audience at his first book signing, he didn't read from the most eloquent passage or the most dramatic chapter. Instead, he read a single line he had written after receiving Claire's first message. "Sometimes, all it takes to resurrect a dream is one person who dares to believe it's still breathing." As the evening light faded and the city's hum softened into night, Ethan walked home with the last rays of sunset painting the sky in gold. He thought about the long years of rejection, the countless times he had almost given up, and realized how necessary they had been. Without the darkness, he might never have recognized the light. Without the silence, he might never have valued the voice that finally answered. Life had come full circle, not as a grand victory but as a quiet redemption. He didn't feel like the man who had conquered the odds. He felt like the man who had finally learned to listen, to himself, to the world, and to the one who believed. And somewhere deep inside he made a silent promise, that he would pay that belief forward. Because sometimes the most powerful gift in the world isn't success, it's the moment someone says, "I believe in you," and means it. And as Ethan Cole stepped into the night, his heart no longer carried the weight of rejection, but the steady, unshakable rhythm of belief that had brought him back to life. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos, as this means a lot to us.